at the end of chapter 10 with this verse, whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. This is the first mention of the cross, of any cross, in the Gospels. So, since we haven't gotten to the crucifixion yet, of course, what does Jesus mean by take up his cross and follow me? I mean, it is a reference to crucifixion, but it's not a reference to Christ's crucifixion. What is he warning his people about? TJ? I think just that word trouble is the best application of this, that watch out for what's about to happen. There's going to be trouble. Just like the people who you see who get crucified outside the cities, it was relatively commonplace for them to see crosses lined up. It was a hideous part of life in the ancient world, but it was a fact of life in the Roman world that there were times when there would be a cross, or 3, or 6, or all of the road to somewhere would be lined with crosses because of this or that uprising or whatever it was. And the reason the Romans did it was as a warning. They did it to stop rebellion. If this is the hideous death of somebody who violates Roman law, then perhaps fewer people will try to violate Roman law. That was the idea behind the cross. And of course, the death of the cross was terrible. People knew that it took some men days to die on a cross. Other men it took simply hours. It depended pretty much, the Gospels share this with us, it pretty much depended on how severely you were beaten beforehand. Some were taken captive after a battle, were simply set up and crucified, and it might take them quite a while to die. Christ was beaten almost to death, and he died the same day, just 6 hours on the cross. It occurred to me last week when I was on break, but still writing devotions every day, I had a little moment, a little aha moment about the morning and evening sacrifices. When did the morning sacrifices happen? It was not right immediately at dawn. That's when the people would be waking up, including the high priest. It was around 9 o'clock in the morning. It was about halfway up to noon when they would make the morning sacrifice at the temple, and that would kind of open the temple for business as far as sacrifices coming in would go. And then the evening sacrifice would happen, not as I would have thought as a child, at sunset or 9 p.m. or even 7 p.m. or something like that, but a couple hours before 6, more like 4 or even 3 in the afternoon is the evening sacrifice. And isn't that interesting that Christ could be both morning and evening sacrifice? He was morning sacrifice because that's when he got nailed up, and he was evening sacrifice because that's when he died, with the morning and evening sacrifice. It just kind of hit me that might not have been exactly when they made those sacrifices on that Friday, but that was about the time that they were made in general. So taking up our crosses is something that we do, and a cross, of course, is total commitment. We think of crosses as, I suppose, suffering that we endure, a difficult path we have to take in life. That can be some very horrible things. A cross can be a physical problem, a disease, a cancer, the loss of a child, a spouse, early loss of a parent. Or it can be something else. It can be something in the mind, a mental condition, an addiction. Certainly a cross that someone has to take up and bear and hang with you. And I'm sure that there are more. Can you think of any more? Or do you want to add something? Is being married to a pastor a cross sometimes?
Well, I don't know any better because I was born into a pastor's home and that's all I know, so maybe that's a good thing, right?
See, my wife told me that the vow she made as a child was she would never marry a preacher. That's what her dad was.
So she went
She knew, and she thought, I'll never marry a pastor.
Okay.
And then she started hanging out with guys at Northwestern College, and
Well, that was her first
pretty much, yeah, there's...
It's a joy all the time.
It is, well, I'll tell you, I would say it's, in one way, it all depends how you look at joy, but I wouldn't want to be anybody else. I'm so grateful I've had these years and have encouraged now my children and grandchildren, please go into the ministry because I'm so lucky.
Good. What about, many of you in here are retired teachers. Is there a cross that's part of teaching?
Sure. There's a cross to everything we do. I'm a nurse, I have crosses. I don't.
Nursing, yeah, sure.
I mean, I think
Sure.
everyone does.
I'm just asking for if you have something to share. Of course, we all have crosses and anything, but
Well, sometimes the pastor is married to the church
yeah,
because they spend so much time and have to do so much good.
right, right. Yeah, there are simply times when it's always been something I've remarked at is when you get the 3 a.m., the 4 a.m. phone call from the police. And the police always act like, well, of course you should have been awake when they call, because they immediately launch into whatever they're going to inform you about and without giving you a moment to say, I'm really just waking up. Who is this again? And they've already given me the address of whoever just passed away or whatever it was, and I've got to go and sit with a widow or whatever it is. There was a time maybe 15 years ago when I had one of those calls, not a suicide, but a death in the night. And they wanted me to come and talk to the widow because the only way to get the man out of his house was to strap him to a gurney, take the legs off, or a board, whatever they call those boards. They had to strap him to it and turn him sideways to get him out the door. There was no other, and they didn't want the wife to see him doing that. So they called me over to talk to the wife while they were getting him out. And afterwards she said, now how did they get him out of the house? And I remember saying, I'm not really sure. But, it's just one of those things. They also had to make a very difficult corner because there was one of those wrought iron railings right outside the front door. It was a tough house to get in and out of, but really difficult to get a body in and out of, and those kinds of things. But those kinds of phone calls where we've had, since I've been here, 2 suicides that I presided over. And Pastor Henning talking to me about the first one, where I would have to tell the family, well, it can't be an open casket, and having the family go into hysterics. Why not? I'd rather not tell you why it can't be an open casket, but it can't be, and things of that nature. And those very, very difficult moments with families. Those are especially hard. Some of you may know that about 3 years ago I got fired from a funeral. One of our men had married a woman outside of our fellowship, and it was always very hard to take him communion because usually his wife would answer the phone and would say that they were busy and I couldn't come. So it was pretty sporadic. I think some years Pastor Sutton told me that he had gotten there twice. I knew that I had gotten there once or twice, and that was all we could get there. And then when he died, he wanted to be buried by us. But it wasn't even a minute into the meeting at the funeral home that the wife said, "I just can't work with you. I need someone else." And the funeral director looked at me and said, "What did you do?" And I thought, "I don't know what I did," but very upset with me. But those are challenging times. We have a member right now whose husband died years ago, and I remember very, very clearly that as he was in his last months, he was very vocal with I hesitate to call it whining, but and his wife would tell him, "Stop whining." That was her action, her word. Now she's doing it. I was just with her yesterday, and she's in her final months, and now what do you think her kids are saying to her? "Stop whining." And she said to me, "How can they talk to me that way?" And I thought, I was here when your husband was in his last weeks and months. But it does happen. And those are crosses down the road we don't think about. How did I treat my family? Because they're going to treat me that way someday. One thing I made sure, I've always made sure I talk to my kids about, my sons, is when the time comes for Dad to go to the nursing home, you guys come and look me in the eye and say, "It's time for you to go to the nursing home." And if I dare to say, "Who said that?" you guys tell me, "Dad, you did." But they all know that. I've been with families that were fighting over this, and often on the doorstep of the nursing home, where someone actually has got their hands on the door frame. "I'm not going in," and the family saying, "You got to go." And well, at least my sons know, you got to go. Your kids know. They're good. Have the conversation while you can. Yeah. I just told them, make sure that you send along my Hogan's Heroes DVDs so the nurse can put a different one in every day. That's what I ask, So, all right. Let's go on with Jesus here in verse 39. "Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." I'm going to continue that with the next couple of verses and talk about all of them. "Whoever receives you receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. Whoever receives a prophet because he's a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. Whoever receives a righteous man because he's a righteous man will receive a righteous man's reward. And whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink because he's my disciple, amen, I tell you, he will never lose his reward." So Jesus letting us know that as we bear our crosses, there are other people around us who are also bearing their crosses. And how do we treat one another as we go along with that? Mind if I turn the fan back on? Anybody warm? I won't do it full blast. All right. Bringing our children to Jesus it's such a fundamental for a Christian. Whether a congregation has a school like we do it here at St. Paul's, I didn't where I grew up. Maybe you didn't where you grew up. I grew up at a church where we just all went to Sunday school. And looking back, I kind of think like my memory workload was about the same as what our kids get at St. Paul's school. They didn't go easy on us. You still had to memorize the catechism. Although I believe we started memorizing the catechism in my childhood sooner than they do at St. Paul's school. We had to know the commandments and the meanings before we got out of third grade. And I get kids coming into seventh grade who haven't begun to memorize those things yet. Maybe it's the memorization technique they have at home, but and maybe you can share this with family members, I'm very much an advocate for what I've seen work in my own household. And it's this. With regard to memory work and learning a passage of the Bible, learning a part of the Bible, bring it out so we can all hear the sound.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Oh, it's Steve. Just a minute.
I will wait. It's okay. Were you talking to me or to Dave?
Steve.
Oh, Steve. Okay, well, that's all right. Forgive me, where was I? Oh, teaching memory treasures. We before our table prayer, our supper time table prayer, we do something with regard to a Bible passage, a little bit of gospel, a couple verses of a psalm. Never anything more, if it's going to be verses, more than 3 verses. Never anything longer than that. Something very short, where 1 or 2 breaths could get you through what you're going to say. Or one little piece of the catechism. And we sometimes do, and because the boys are grown now, Bible trivia. Bible trivia last night, for example, was name brothers in the Bible taking a journey together. And why do we do that? Because 2 of my sons are on a trip, and so the other 2 were home, and I thought, and sometimes you can't get 5, 6 answers out of a question, but you can get 3 or 4. And so we did that. And so I was pretty impressed. My sons both went for New Testament examples. When Jesus sent out the 12, some of those were in pairs of brothers, Peter and Andrew, James and John, and so forth. I actually forgot what Peter said. It was also a New Testament answer. And I went for 2 brothers talking in Genesis. Hey, let's go out to the field together. Who said that? Cain, yeah, said that to Abel. So that was, but those often if we have a guest especially, we'll just pick a commandment and I'll just say, pick anybody in the Bible who is either keeping or breaking that commandment. 2nd commandment, 5th commandment, 6th commandment, whatever it is. And then people think about that. Usually they come up with breaking and not keeping, but something like that. But if you do that same thing with memory work, with say the grandchild who has to memorize thirdly of baptism, right? And they have a week to do it. So what do? You say it, you read it together the first night. And then you read it again the second night. And then the third night you try and say it and you giggle through it the third or fourth night. And by the 5th, 6th, and 7th nights, the child who needs to learn it will have learned it. And I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, there was a lot of spanking and crying when it came to learning memory work. In my household, there was a lot. And it was just a lot of tears and a lot of, well, you sit there until you learn it. And that's the way it was. And that having the whole family help the child is an easier way, a lighter way, and a more memorable way, I find, of doing it, because you're bound to have somebody in the family who figured out maybe a trick to learning this one, whatever it is. Is there a little rhyme in there? Is there a little rhythm? Is it one of, that Paul and Luther both loved lists. So sometimes you get those lists, right? Clothing and shoes, meat and drink, house and home, land. Did you learn cattle? I did. And all my goods and so forth. And sometimes you can get going with actions on those, right? Clothing and shoes, meat and drink, and house and home and so forth and whatever. Okay. So that's also part of this cup of cold water to drink, is not only their physical needs, but their spiritual needs as well. Okay. Anything that far? That's the end of chapter 10. You've been listening to Invisible Church, the Bible study podcast from St. Paul's Lutheran Church, New Ulm, Minnesota.